Welcome to the November 2021 edition of Learning Well, produced by the Integrative Health Education Center at Normandale Community College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm your host, Elise Markham-Johnson. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us this evening. We hope our monthly conversations on our Learning Well program will continue to provide both interesting and practical information for you and your family and friends as you pursue your health and wellness journey this year and in 2022. We are especially pleased to have with us tonight Colin Campbell, Ph.D. His 6 decades of pioneering and groundbreaking research on nutrition is legendary. His research and advocacy has literally changed the world's understanding of how what we eat can cause or prevent cancer and other diseases. And he's rightly considered the father of the whole food plant-based approach to nutrition. We are absolutely honored to have Dr. Campbell with us tonight to discuss his most recent book, The Future of Nutrition: An Insider's Look at the Science, Why We Keep Getting It Wrong, and How to Start Getting It Right. But before I introduce Dr. Campbell, I want to take just a moment to thank the Integrative Health Education Center at Normandale Community College for producing our monthly Learning Well programs. And I also want to let you know that Normandale's Integrative Health Education Center offers classes in literally hundreds of areas of health and wellness for anyone interested in exploring these areas. And they also offer classes for those who wish to proceed to the next level of education through a wide range of classes offering certification in a variety of areas such as healing touch, energy medicine, nutrition, and herbalism. For more information about classes and programs at the Integrative Health Education Center, we encourage you to call 952-358-8343, or you can simply email Normandale at www.normandale.edu/ce/classes. So now let's move on with our conversation. We are delighted to have as our guest tonight, Dr. Colin Campbell. Dr. Campbell has been dedicated to the science of human health for more than 60 years. His primary focus is on the association between diet and disease, particularly cancer. And although largely known for the China study, one of the most comprehensive studies of health and nutrition ever conducted, and recognized by the New York Times as the Grand Prix of epidemiology, Dr. Campbell's profound impact also includes extensive involvement in education, public policy, and laboratory research. Dr. Campbell grew up on a dairy farm and was the first in his family to go to college, where he studied pre-veterinary medicine at Pennsylvania State University. And after obtaining his bachelor's degree and while completing his first year at the University of Georgia Veterinary School, he received a telegram from a well-known professor at Cornell University offering a scholarship and research opportunity that was simply too good to turn down. And so he completed his education at Cornell University, his MS and his PhD, and at MIT as a research associate in nutrition, biochemistry, and toxicology. He then spent 10 years on the faculty of Virginia Tech's Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition before returning to Cornell in 1975, where he presently holds his endowed chair as the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry in the Division of Nutritional Sciences. Dr. Campbell's research experience includes both laboratory experiments and large-scale human studies. He has received over 70 grant years of peer-reviewed research funding, mostly with NIH, served on grant review panels of multiple funding agencies, actively participated in the development of national and international nutrition policy, and authored over 350 research papers, most published in peer-reviewed science journals. Throughout his career, he's confronted a great deal of confusion surrounding nutrition and its effects. It is precisely this confusion that he has focused on so much in recent years. And in order to synthesize the findings of his long and rewarding career and to give back to the public whose lives are threatened by rampant misinformation and special interests, Dr. Campbell co-wrote the China study, Startling Implications for Diet, Weight Loss, and Long-Term Health. It was first published in 2005 and has sold more than 3 million copies worldwide. It's also been translated into 50 foreign languages. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller Whole, The Low Carb Fraud and the Future of Nutrition, an insider's look at the science, why we keep getting it wrong, and how to start getting it right. Several documentary films feature Dr. Campbell and his research, including Forks Over Knives, Eating You Alive, Food Matters, and Plant Pure Nation. He continues to share evidence-based information on health and nutrition whenever given the opportunity. And he's delivered hundreds of lectures around the world and is the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies and the online Plant-Based Nutrition Certificate in partnership with eCornell. Dr. Campbell, welcome. We are so delighted and honored to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, and for those very kind comments as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Well, first of all, I think it would be really interesting for our audience, Dr. Campbell, to share with us how you first got interested in the whole field of nutrition.
Well, in the introduction that you just gave, you'll notice there that it was almost accidental for me. I was headed to be a veterinarian. I got that surprise, unsolicited telegram offering me an opportunity to go to graduate school at Cornell University. And so I jumped ship. I went there. There it was. I went through that training. I actually did my doctoral dissertation, I should point out, on advancing the consumption of more animal protein, of all things. That was consistent with my background on the farm, milking cows, and was consistent with the views of most people, of course. And so finally, I got into my academic position at Virginia Tech, and then I was locked into it. I was actually formerly in two professions, one in pharmacology and the other nutrition. So I was kind of weighing the two ideas regarding the determination of good health and prevention of disease, and nutrition won out.
And we're so glad it did. Thank goodness. Well, it was during your work in the Philippines that you learned something that set you on a new direction in your career. Could you just take a few moments to tell us about this experience?
Sure. My responsibility at that time was to coordinate a feeding program for malnourished children in the Philippines. And there we were supposed to be making sure that these children got enough protein. That was a typical view in those days of malnourished children. And possibly, if we're going to increase protein intake, it should be animal-based, which is so-called high quality. I saw something that was surprising. It seemed like to me that children getting the most protein, and they were few in number, they had a higher risk for getting liver cancer. And then there was a study, an experimental animal study in India that showed something similar. I said, wait a minute, I've got to go back to the lab and find out if that's true. Does animal protein increase cancer? Even if it's experimental. So I then got a grant, that lasted for many years. I examined that question from A to Z almost, repeated that study. Sure enough, animal protein, when it's increased, increases the development of liver cancer, at least in those rats. Plant protein did not do that. It got so prominent, so exciting in a sense, we could turn on cancer development by giving more animal protein. We can turn it off by either decreasing the animal protein or replacing it with plant protein. Really quite remarkable. At that point in time, then we learned a great deal of how it worked too.
When was this? What years are we talking about here?
Those years were between 1965 and 1975, all at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition.
Well, you spent years doing research and working with students doing research, trying to determine the key mechanism that accounts for this protein effect with cancer. And the hope, as I understand it, was that this mechanism could be blocked so that cancer could be stopped. What were some of the results that came from this research, and what conclusions did you end up reaching about this?
Well, my first comment on the reason for asking that question, what's the mechanism? That's typical of those of us in research. If we see something that's a cause-effect relationship that's important, especially provocative like this one, then we should understand better how it works. And so I was looking for the key mechanism, as we say, in the hope that if we were able to identify that mechanism, possibly we might develop a drug, to prevent that from happening for those people eating animal protein. But as I started looking, we, over a series of about to at least 10, 12 years with a number of students, looking at each of these mechanisms carefully. Every time we look for a mechanism, the key mechanism, if you will, we found one. The high protein diet increased the rate of the mutations forming. It increased the binding of the reactive product of the carcinogen to the DNA, which is the stuff of genes. So therefore, the high protein increased the mutation rate. And so it went. And after the new cancer cells were there, it actually compromised the immune system that would otherwise come into play to block it. So here was the message. There was no such thing as a key mechanism. There were 10 by that time. I could probably count a couple more. Every time we look, and some of them, the activity went up and a couple went down. But the point was that every single one that changed in unison, whether it went up or down, all to produce the same result, namely increasing cancer. That was to me, that was just a kind of a groundbreaking thing from my way of thinking, because in science, we tend to think of, there's a cause for a disease, and when the disease occurs, we try to find a chemical to treat it, let's say. So both on the causal end and on the treatment end, we look for a drug. That's the basis for quite frankly, for much of the drug industry. Find something that can target that mechanism. We call it targeted drug therapy. That's so foundational for the entire operation of the pharmaceutical approach to controlling health. What we were learning, that's false. That with this particular nutrient, in this case, animal protein, the same thing applied for other nutrients too. When a nutrient comes in, it operates through a multiple mechanisms at the same time, all highly coordinated in almost like a mysterious way. Why that unison? Why that symphony effect? It's almost like, who's the director here? What's going on? And so it really turned my world of understanding, first of pharmacology, which I was in at the time, and my understanding of nutrition, it turned it upside down. The nutrition was much more powerful and could be used, in this case, to control the formation of the disease. At the same time, as we'll talk about in a moment, the same kind of nutrition protocol that prevents the disease actually can be used in many instances to reverse or treat disease already present. Okay, I've said enough. That's
well, there has been some really fascinating research over the years on other diseases besides cancer that can be prevented or can be suspended or cured through whole food plant-based diets. Can you talk a little bit about what other diseases have been linked to what I guess I would call our traditional American diet?
Sure. And I'm going to call on my colleagues, some of my colleagues, especially in the clinic, who actually did some of this. So I did some things in the laboratory, but ultimately we'd like to do it in the clinic with humans. But in any case, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, Dr. Dean Ornish, some years later, was able to show that heart disease could be reversed, let alone be prevented. And Dr. John McDougall, who had quite a program going at the time, he was actually exploring other diseases too. And so because of this multiple mechanism effect, I postulated for myself that that is so profound that it doesn't operate on one disease at a time. It's very likely it's going to have an effect on a very broad spectrum of diseases. In this case, what we call chronic degenerative diseases, like heart disease, diabetes, all the cancers, chronic kidney disease. My son, who co-authored a book with the China Study with me, he's now a physician himself on a university faculty, and he actually published recently just a case study that a person with advanced chronic kidney disease, put them on the diet, it goes away. It goes away. And that's the thing that also really, really excited me, because the cause of these diseases, can be actually used in a sense of reversing or treating the diseases in many cases. It's like one grand scheme, for our existence. What helps us to let's say, prevent disease. Also, in many cases, even for those who already have the disease, it helps them to reverse the disease, get things turned around. So very exciting.
And I'll never forget the first couple paragraphs of Dr. Michael Greger's book, How Not to Die, where he talks about his grandmother, who basically had been through all kinds of heart surgeries. And they basically said, well, there's nothing more we can do for you. And they expected her to die in a year. And she totally reversed her diet, started exercising, and lived another 15 years as a result of it. I mean, there's just such stunning information out there about what can happen. But so my question is, why has this research been, for the most part, ignored?
Well, I spent about at least 20 years rather intensively involved in national policy development. Also given a lot of lectures. So I lectured a lot to medical schools and other places. And so I learned a lot firsthand experience being involved in national policy development. I was on expert panels, for example, the National Academy of Sciences. I was actually the lead liaison for the medical research community to Congress for a while. So I happened to see this from a very senior level. And I became curious myself back in the 80s. Why is there such a resistance to this idea? So I got into history. I was that year I spent a year at Oxford University in England. And I got into history, and I think I discovered something, at least for me, that was absolutely fascinating. Back in the 1800s, it was learned there were two hypotheses for cancer formation, for example. One was called the local theory of disease. In other words, the cancer is locally formed. Don't worry about it, we can cut it out. You can imagine the surgeons like that. The alternative was constitutional nature of disease, which involves something about the whole body, maybe something about the whole diet. They didn't specifically mention nutrition at that time, but there were these two theories. Well, the local theory of disease won out in the late 1800s with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and that development of industries and so forth in the 20th century, the 1900s. The whole idea was that disease is a specific entity, almost acting, let's say, independently. In other words, it's local. And therefore, we could use a single thing, if we knew what the mechanism was, we can use a single thing to actually attack that disease, either prevent it or maybe reverse it. So and what happened was, to answer the question, we got into a paradigm of thinking that that disease is it's not correct to think of each disease as entity all by itself. It's not right to think about a single nutrient or a single chemical treatment. They work together. That is, and what we have now in the corporate sector and our mindsets, whether we're in a corporate mode of thinking or not, we've gotten them in this mindset of believing that measures is best practice by focusing our attention on one thing at a time, independent of everything else. And what I'm saying is that what I learned, that's incorrect. That's incorrect. We can talk about almost like a grand plan. Just eat the right food. And then at the cellular level, it just works as magic.
Well, you're the author of the 2005 book called The China Study, which is the most, also, this is part of the title, the most comprehensive study of nutrition ever conducted and the startling implications for diet, weight loss, and long-term health. This was really a groundbreaking study. And for our listeners who aren't familiar with this work, could you just share with us some of the most important findings from this research that we haven't already touched on?
Well, first I should say that when the opportunity came to do the work in China, this was in the early 1980s, just at the time when the United States and China were first starting to speak to each other more or less. And the first senior scientist from China, Dr. Chen Zheshe, visited me at Cornell and stayed with me for a while. And I learned that the Chinese government had basically established an atlas of cancer mortality for about a dozen different cancers. And what they learned, and this was a survey in 1973 to 75, I think it was, what they learned is that for about a dozen different cancers, they were localized geographically in certain places, much more so than other places. So I said, let's go there and do a study. This is the first research project between the United States and China, I should say. I got fantastic cooperation and brilliant contribution from an epidemiologist in Oxford University by the name of Sir Richard Peto. But in any case, we got together to do the study. I was particularly interested in doing that study, not only because cancer was localized in various places, it offered this opportunity. If we went there and could learn the difference between the high rate areas, the low rate areas, we learned something. I also saw it as an opportunity to vindicate or deny what I was seeing in the laboratory. Because by this time in the laboratory, I'm seeing pretty fantastic stuff. And then ultimately, then the question becomes, well, does this apply to humans? And so, yeah, we did the study with the humans, about 6,500 families and their members. And we repeated it later, even with a bigger thing. But what we learned was that as soon as people start using more animal-based foods, presumably in order to get that animal protein that's so precious, that's when these diseases start to appear. That's when blood cholesterol starts to go up from quite low levels in China compared to us. Its levels go up. And so the so-called Western diseases that we're familiar with, cancers, various kinds, cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, and so forth, diabetes, these diseases are typically in Western countries. They start to come on the scene as soon as people start consuming more of a Western kind of diet. And it didn't take much. A very small amount of animal food, for example. We saw that particularly, this is in the second part of that study, for a viral disease, which is very exciting. This is a virus that has been more serious, more than the current coronavirus, by the way. It's a very serious virus. It kills about 800,000 people a year. It causes cancer. And so in that case, not only did we learn that, as blood cholesterol sort of increased in response to consuming a Western kind of diet, and therefore they get more of these diseases, so too do they get more of that viral disease. Quite spectacular. I just published that this year earlier. So here, what we learned, I went there, as I say, to expand on what we learned in the laboratory and or to confirm or deny what we learned. And what we learned was just it basically consistent with what we learned in the lab. Of course, I had access to lots of other studies done by my colleagues, and other researchers were published too. So everything kind of fit together. It kind of fit together. So the China study, a human study in this case, was very nicely organized thanks to my Chinese colleagues and my British colleagues as well. We really had a nice study that led the New York Times to call it the Grand Prix of epidemiology. It was quite a number of people, and we measured many different things. So we could really examine cause and effect reasonably in an interesting way.
What reaction did you get after this book was published?
Well, the book was actually, the first results were published in 1990. And just prior to that, some folks in my research community, they had become aware of this study, and they were knowing at that point in time where I guess it was headed, because it was kind of the early results were leaking out. And I had been on a couple of national committees at that time, so I had a fairly prominent voice in the field. I put in to answer your question, just to illustrate, I put in a request for expansion of that study involving 500,000 people, working with our Chinese colleagues, collecting blood from them every 2 years and storing it, so that then when people died, we had enough number of deaths for a certain disease, we could go back and retrieve those blood samples collected, let's say, every 2 years prior to their dying. We can put a combination of numbers together to see what killed them. Okay, that was the idea. I put that in, it got a very high rating. I went to collect the money, said, come down and get the money. It was for $7 million. I went to Washington to collect the money. One of the individuals there, one of the directors of one of the NIH institutes, sorry, we have a letter here from the Friends of the Institute of Aging, unsigned, that says you're a fraud. And so I never got the money. That I think that's the best way, and that's just one example. The resistance to this idea that nutrition has this enormously impressive effect, and it's very consistent. It's cheap. It's cheap for the user, if only they're told. So that's what, as I say, makes me go back and look at the literature. It makes me inquire about, how do we form policy in this country? And the only thing I can say is that we are, as an entire society, we're wedded, most of us, we're wedded to the so-called Western model. And the Western model means, we can eat good food, good, rich food, if you will, especially to make sure we get enough of that animal protein, that's for sure. And eat other kinds of food that taste good, lots of salt and sugar and oil added to it, if you will. That combination has put us into a rut. But nonetheless, it's supportive of some major industries. They're not going to give up their work lightly. And so, and I'm troubled by that, obviously. And I don't know anything to do with it, and just keep on plowing ahead, just telling it like what we know it to be.
Do you see more an acceptance of this kind of research in other parts of the world? Do you see any hope in Europe or Asia?
Yes, in particular in Asia, and let's say the Asian countries, they are more accepting because that's what they lived with for the last few hundred years. I mean, they're mostly a plant-based type of diet. In the Western countries, like in Europe and so forth, eating more like we do, like Western countries do, they have diets similar to ours. And my sense is, and this is, I just have to, my sense is, yes, I think are on they're more likely to take this seriously. And I'm suggesting, I don't know any proof of this, but I lectured a lot in Europe. I'm suggesting that there they have a more one-payer system, healthcare system, and where there's not it doesn't depend so much on just exactly the kind of income the individual people get. They're more likely to accept things like this for the good of the public.
Well, you've also talked about the fact that statins are a multi-billion-dollar industry, and if you would so appreciate your sharing with us the research that led to the development of statins and what we now know about their impact on lowering cholesterol.
Well, that is an illustration of my concern about this targeted drug therapy I mentioned before. I mean, we all lived with that idea in research. We have to find out what is the mechanism, so to speak. Well, what came about in the 1980s and actually before was that as serum cholesterol goes up, that's associated with more heart disease. That was a pretty well established, almost fact, you could say. That was a popular idea. Higher blood cholesterol, higher heart disease risk. Well, then let's find a way to get it down. So they wanted to find the mechanism that synthesizes cholesterol in our bodies. They found it. They found what they considered to be the key mechanism, an enzyme catalyzed reaction. And so they turned around and found a chemical that could inhibit that reaction and therefore decrease cholesterol levels to some extent. That was a solution. That was a solution, so the story went. And that came, they actually developed a drug called statins. So there's a cluster of these statins. They in turn, have been shown to decrease blood cholesterol to some extent. But whether that leads to a lower rates of heart disease is another question. It's kind of uncertain. There's some studies seem a little bit, convincing that it might decrease heart disease by as much as 10% or so. But really, they all have side effects. All drugs have side effects. So even to the extent that it might work for some folks, it's limited. It's severely limited. And it comes along with side effects that no one wants to talk about. Whereas in contrast, my colleagues, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn at Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Dean Ornish in California, University of California, the University of California, those two gentlemen and Dr. John McDougall, in particular, they're clinicians. They were able to show, and this is in late 1980s, early during the 1990s, they could reverse heart disease. That was Ornish and Esselstyn in particular. McDougall was showing, you get better health in 2 or 3 different fronts. And they weren't discussing in the context of what I'm talking about in terms of nutrition, but nonetheless, these are the results they got. And so I'm saying, I got to know these guys. They contacted me and so forth. And so we've gotten together, become good friends. And when you put all this story together, plus some more folks now getting involved in it since then, the story is becoming really, really powerful.
Do you happen to know, I remember when Dean Ornish's book first came out, and I was so fascinated by what he was involved with. And did insurance companies ever support the work he was doing? Did that ever come about?
Yes.
They did,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in the case of Dr. Ornish, I think that's one of his major contributions. He got busy, and I understand he told me, I think he spent 14 or 15 years working on that. And yes, he did. He had some success in getting people with that using that kind of treatment to be covered. I don't know how far that's gone. I can't speak to that, but still, there's this massive denial that nutrition has that much to do with anything.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your younger son earlier, and I understand from your book that he's currently conducting a study involving women who have stage 4 cancer that's returned. Can you tell us anything about that at this point, or are you not able to do so?
Well, I can say what the study is. I can't tell you the results, of course.
Okay.
That's his territory, and he don't want to get ahead of himself.
Right.
But the point is, the cancer he was looking at and has been looking at with his wife, by the way, who's a physician too. The two of them, they've organized this program following women with stage 4 breast cancer. That means the cancer is now metastasized. I mean, this is a tough cancer, let's face it. And so they've now, they're just at the end of recruiting all the number of women they need to recruit. They have some results, and yeah, I don't want to speak to that because I don't want to, forecast. I just think it's a very exciting study.
Good. Any rough guideline on when those kinds of results might be available that we could hear about?
Well, I don't know. They got about half the people now have gone through. I think it's an 8. I forget what it is. I think it's an 8-month trial period, which is see what they see. So it's somewhat limited. But they unfortunately, by the nature of the way we do research, they can't test the diet all by itself.
Yeah.
Let's say instead of pharmacologic treatment, they say that's not the authorities wouldn't allow that. So unfortunately, the treatment group is a group of people who change their diet, but still maintaining their chemotherapy treatment. I personally find that a big compromise. So, but nonetheless, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to your more recent book. I love the title, An Insider's Look at the Science, Why We Keep Getting It Wrong, and and about how can we get it right in the future. You focus on 3 primary reasons for the controversy, and we've touched on some of those, but the first reason is that the whole food plant-based diet challenges the conventional understanding of disease, both its causes and treatments. How did that approach develop?
Well, I've gone through a lot of research over the years and had various and sundry ideas. At more recent years, I've boiled down the recommendations, so to speak, to 2 main things.
Uh-huh.
Let's eat plants, number 1. Number 2, let's eat the plants in a so-called whole food form. I don't mean by that you have to eat, you can't cut it up and dice it and process. I'm simply saying when you eat the food, eat all the parts of it together, because that's the way nature likes to work with it. Instead of like taking out one nutrient or something like that and trying that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm sorry I missed your first. I'm getting off track here.
That's okay. It's no problem. But in your book, you talk about the fact that the first reason is the whole food plant-based diet challenges conventional understanding, its causes and treatments, and just sort of the background on how that approach developed.
Well, I did come up with the idea of plant-based. Back in about 1980, I was on a National Cancer Institute so-called study section we talked about. It had to do with chemical carcinogenesis. This was a group of people, there were I think 14, 15 of us, who actually assembled to review applications for funding, for NIH and determine who gets the high priorities, who don't. Well, I was on the one for cancer. I was the only one with a nutrition background in that case. And there were some interest being expressed in those days, around 1980, that, let's look a little bit at the nutritional effect. My colleagues, all in molecular biology and oncology and genetics and so forth, they weren't familiar with the nutrition idea. So they asked me if I couldn't come along and give a little short program on nutrition, which I did. I didn't want to use, to be honest about it, the word vegetarian, because I thought the information was trending in that direction. But the word vegetarian was not exactly the kind of thing you sell people on in science. So I had to come up with another term, and I said, well, what the heck, I'll call it plant-based. That was kind of hurried, because I wanted to focus on the science in this argument. Later, I was also then the witness for the National Academy of Science and hearings on, let's say, nutrient supplements, individual nutrients being, and that was quite an experience. That was in the early 80s also. And there were people in the corporate sector wanted to develop a supplement industry based on a report that I was the author of in National Academy of Science. They wanted to take these nutrients we're talking about and put them in a pill, which, and then I was called on by the Academy to be the one, the principal witness as to whether or not those claims were valid or not. I had 3 years of that experience and finally concluded on that nutrient supplements is not the way to go. Not only because of that, but because other research too. So as I was recommended against that idea. That was not the way to solve problems. So that's why I brought in the word whole.
Okay.
Whole based.
The other thing that's fascinating is that evidence suggests that a huge percent of deaths caused by heart disease, cancer, and stroke, plus medical error deaths related to these treatments, could be prevented. So what kinds of percentages are we actually talking about in terms of how much could be prevented?
Well, we have various numbers. My favorite numbers is at least 80%.
Wow.
90%. We're in that territory. And because if people did this in theory, that's what, rely on the results that especially my friend Dr. Esselstyn gets and Dr. McDougall and others. If people start this kind of diet, this is not for just the purpose of doing it for a couple of weeks or a month or something like that. It kind of has to become a lifestyle. When they do it that way, and then we look at, let's say, lifestyle figures, it turns out that heart disease and these other diseases, it's a straight line relationship, what we call a linear regression for, let's say, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, so forth, with the consumption of animal protein-based diets. And in that case, when we consume more animal foods to get that good protein, it just so happens we consume less plant foods. So when we see these kind of relationships, there's lots going on there. They're representing a constellation of results, all of which lead to the same result, the same endpoint. And so you see these lines is related to, say, to animal protein, for example. That's also because in part, the plants are contributing their good effects. Plants have dietary fiber and complex carbohydrates. They have all kinds of antioxidants and so forth and so on. That combination, more plants, less animal food, that equals health on a very broad scale.
One of the things that you hear often is the thought that, well, can you really get enough nutrition if you don't eat animal protein? So what's your response to that?
Yeah, that is a popular idea. And I think I've had kind of the good fortune in a sense of being in that field because when I did my graduate studies, my doctoral dissertation was on advancing the consumption of more animal protein, which was consistent with my coming from the farm, also consistent with my colleagues. That's everybody believed that. And so that's why when I went to the Philippines with the children and I saw something in contrast, it was hard for me too, to accept that kind of notion. That's why we had to work so hard to see whether or not it's true. And so in any case, I'm sorry, I lost my track of it again.
That's okay. So how do you get enough nutrition if you're not eating animal protein?
Yeah, that's right. That was the question. And there, I'm sorry, the screen. Okay. Yeah. There, we tend to consume animal protein because we value it, because it is high quality, so to speak. Well, it turns out that concept, high quality, that everyone sort of accepts, there's a scientific basis, so the story goes, for it being high quality. What it represents is animal protein, as opposed to plant protein. Animal protein, a higher percent of the protein being consumed is actually retained by the body, supposed to do good things. When that concept first arose, what it meant, it stimulated growth rate. So everybody lived with that. All animal protein is all high quality, plant protein is low quality. And so the only way you can get enough protein from plants is mix and match, essentially combine. Whereas I went back and I'm familiar with the history on this, I'm familiar with the politics and the policy and the science. And it turns out the idea that animal protein is high quality is false. It's been false for a long time. Nonetheless, we as a society, most of us in our society, I'm included, we came to believe that animal protein was high quality. We have to get that. A lot of people believe that's the only way you get enough protein, consuming lots of animal food. That's false. Because the more protein we retain, which in the case of this animal-based protein, the more protein we retain, that's associated with increases in risk of cancer. That's associated with an increased synthesis of blood cholesterol, which in turn associates with heart disease, and on and on. As I said before, I, of course, learned that in the experimental animal studies we were doing. And so we have to, how should we say it, step away from that obviously very popular idea that we need all the protein we can get. And a lot of people think that, well, that means eat lots of animal food. It's false. It's not true. Plant diets have all the protein we need.
And I think it's also interesting that, we talk about the incredible economic machines that are part of this whole situation and problem, the huge multi-billion dollar food industry, et cetera. But also, there's been so much concern over the past few years about skyrocketing healthcare costs. And I would assume that you would feel that those costs some of those costs are really preventable if we go in the direction of nutrition.
Yes, that goes back to your earlier question about what percent of the diseases might be prevented. And I use more or less the same figures. So we're talking about savings in healthcare costs. I'm going to suggest, with some confidence, we can save at least 75 to 85% of total healthcare costs, because that's the proportion of the cost that's being used to treat us for these diseases that are caused by the Western kind of diet. So that's my rationale for that point of view. And so, if we all just switched our diets in theory, really got there and do it the right way, the saving of the healthcare costs could be enormous. It could be enormous. And unfortunately, in the policy arena, I can maybe offer a comment on that. At the United States Department of Agriculture and the US government, they were the ones mostly looking up for the animal industry, the livestock industry. They're the ones that developed the so-called dietary guidelines. Those dietary guidelines, they're not to question the consumption of animal protein, I should say. So in effect, those guidelines are being told to the public, in a sense, is kind of very only lightly touching this problem. They're allowing people to eat the wrong food. So we get sick. So we have more sickness. What does that mean? More business. Yes, that's good for the pharmaceutical industry. So you have one arm of the government allowing for, in fact, even encouraging, if you will, the consumption of the wrong food that makes us sick, which in turn delivers up a much higher population of potential patients that can be treated, let's say by disease. Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's really kind of a wicked formula. Our history shows us quite clearly in the policies in this case that we tend to encourage, if you will. People don't do this intentionally. I don't want to get into that question. But we tend to encourage, sickness, unintentionally, but that's what we do.
Yeah. Well,
And
you have an interesting postscript to your book as well, and it's titled, Could Changing Our Diets Defeat COVID-19? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, this when the COVID thing broke about a year and a half ago, as you know, in this country, that story, I all of a sudden recalled that we had data from our second China study that was a cooperative project between mainland China and Taiwan, by the way, even bigger than the first one. We had data there where we were trying to understand for 3 or 4 different viral diseases whether nutrition had anything to do with them. And the one we studied in most detail was the most serious one, and that's primary liver cancer. And so, the primary liver cancer is a prominent disease in China. It's the 5th highest mortality of all cancers in the world, I think. But in any case, liver cancer is a problem, mostly in Asian and African countries. So we had a chance to see what causes liver cancer in China, these high-risk areas. We measured lots of nutritional factors in the blood or food consumption and so forth. We also measured the prevalence of antigen to the virus. That's the active virus. We also measured the prevalence of the antibody to the virus. And we measured multiple different ways, and everything pointed in the same direction. The more plant-based food was consumed, those folks, they formed antibodies to the virus. And it was not, and in turn, those folks did not lead to liver cancer. So they did not get the liver cancer for the most part. That's what the data suggests. In contrast, those consuming more animal food, only 10% on average of what we do here in the West, even that small amount, those folks did not form the antibodies. They retained the active virus still in their blood. They were the ones who got the liver cancer. I'm talking about statistical significance at the level of, for those familiar with this, a probability level of 0.001. Highly statistically significant results for multiple factors, all pointing to the same result. We consume a little bit of animal food in that case. That's what led to the virus remaining active and causing the disease that it causes. People consuming if they don't consume the animal food, then they consume the plant food. The more plant food they get, the other ones form the antibody. And so we had some more data on that too. We were able to show in laboratory studies in those days, back some 30 years ago, more now, we were able to show that in experimental animals, the ones taking more animal protein to turn on the cancer, one of the mechanisms by which that works, it repressed the formation of what we call natural killer cells, which is expression of the immune system. So more animal protein represses this one of these mechanisms we have to protect us. So more animal protein depresses natural killer cells. Natural killer cells operate across the whole spectrum of diseases, you might know. They're part of the immune system. And that I thought that was kind of a spectacular idea too. So the ones who consume more animal food, they retain the presence of the antigen. They don't form the antibodies. And then repress. That's just some of the things we've looked at. If we looked on further, I'm really convinced that we would see a whole lot of factors that would feed into that same hypothesis.
Dr. Campbell, for our listeners who want to learn more about the whole food plant-based diet and what it looks like, along with maybe some possible menus, recipes, that kind of thing, do you have any resources you can point us toward?
Yes, we have an online program that's done very well. It was a course I taught on campus. When I took my emeritus position, we put it into a nonprofit. Then we partnered with the online program of Cornell, and that's done really well. Our course has been number one amongst a few hundred courses, for all these years. And we call it nutritionstudies.org, nutritionstudies.org. And so that's a 6-week program that people can take online. And they do that. And so they can get credit to physicians and other professionals can get, continuing medical education credits essentially. And it's done really well. We're very excited about that. Now, my daughter, whose doctorate is in education, she's heading that up. And we're reaching out to other places around the world, we have some resources now we can help. Just to try to help this message get out there, and listen and support all kinds of different people. This is very exciting. I mean, I think that this idea is finally beginning to register, and that means it's registering for people. I don't care where they live.
Well, am I right did your daughter actually write a cookbook, a recipe book?
Yes, my daughter, Leanne Campbell, wrote a recipe book, and our daughter-in-law, Kim Campbell, also has one. That was
great.
After her husband, our son. He's the one that directed a film called Plant Pure Nation.
Okay.
See on Netflix.
Okay.
I think Amazon, it's Amazon Prime. But anyhow, our son, his wife, Kim, she's had cooking classes. And so Kim's cookbook is Plant Nation Cookbook, I think it's called. Our daughter's is the China Study Cookbook. So there, and then I have lots of colleagues. I must tell you, I've got a lot of really good friends in this business now are just turning out a ton of cookbooks.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Go on the web, and there's a whole lot of people in there that putting out some of these delicious recipes.
Great. So can I ask, and maybe this is not a comfortable question, but what does a typical day of your food intake look like? I mean, a breakfast, lunch, dinner, what might it consist of?
Well, my quick answer is I eat what my wife fixes me. But no, she's been a partner totally. This is, we're going on our 60th wedding, our 60th anniversary.
Congratulations.
So we have 5 grown children and 11 grandchildren. The whole family, we're 100% that way. And so she has really been a master at, sort of keeping care of the food takes care of the food we eat. She gradually changed it for herself and myself and our children. And so I have in the morning, it's almost, I don't know, almost too routine, but it's oatmeal with lots of fruit on it, fresh fruit. In wintertime, maybe some frozen fruit that we pick. At lunchtime, we have a salad. I crave salads. I thought I'd never say that. But we have that as salad. And in the evening, we have cooked meal, the variety of dishes that she fixes. But I'm going to give all the credit to her.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Well, we'll look forward to checking out your daughter and daughter-in-law's books as well. Is there anything we haven't touched on that we should before we conclude?
Yeah, and one more thing. My wife also, I have to give her credit for my writing the China Study. Because I was getting pushback, a lot of it. And of course, I was telling her about, she told me, stop complaining. She was on my case. She said, why don't you write a book for the public? So I retired and wrote the book for the public.
Well, thank your wife for us, please. Well, Dr. Campbell, this has been absolutely delightful. So much wonderful information. So grateful to you for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you.
Okay. Well, before we close tonight, I just wanted to let our listeners know about some of the leaders and innovators in the field of integrative health and holistic health and wellness who will be joining us on Learning Well in the coming months. Next month in December, our guest will be acclaimed novelist Donald Antrim. He's received numerous prestigious grants and awards, including being named a MacArthur Fellow. And we'll be discussing his most recent book, One Friday in April, A Story of Suicide and Survival, which is a searing and really brave memoir that offers a new understanding of suicide from someone who's been on the brink and back. And to start off the new year, our January guest is Dr. Howard L. Weiner. He's professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He's pioneered the development of immune therapy for MS and other nervous system diseases, including Alzheimer's, ALS, and brain tumors. And we'll be discussing his most recent book, The Brain Under Siege, Solving the Mystery of Brain Disease and How Scientists Are Following the Clues to a Cure. So we hope you can join us for those upcoming programs. And also want to let you know that since our Learning Well programs are archived, you can explore past conversations with a variety of leaders in the field of health and wellness, including Dr. Michael Roizen and Dr. Michael Gregor. Dr. Roizen is the Cleveland Clinic's Chief Wellness Officer and author of This Is Your Do-Over, The 7 Secrets to Losing Weight, Living Longer, and Getting the Second Chance at the Life You Want. And Dr. Gregor is author of How Not to Die, which looks at the 15 top causes of death in America, the best nutritional and lifestyle interventions for prevention to those diseases. If you wish to check out these and other archived Learning Well programs, all you need to do is simply Google Normandale Community College Learning Well. In closing, I just want to thank again our guest, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, and I'd also like to thank the Integrative Health Education Center at Normandale for producing this program. And if you enjoy our Learning Well program, we encourage you to let at least one other person know about our conversations each month on Learning Well. We hope you can be with us for our next Learning Well program in December with our guest, our author, Donald Antrim. And until then, we want to thank you for being with us tonight, and we want to encourage you to stay well. Take care.